It's a pleasure to have you all here today. My name is Jennifer Victor. As you can tell, I am not David Barker. He was intended to moderate this program, and he called me in as a pinch hitter, if you will, because he apparently has World Series tickets and is now in Houston. But he frantically texted me over the weekend when he realized there was going to be this conflict, and he thought the audience would be both forgiving of his excuse and hopefully welcoming of me as his inferior substitute here. I have some affiliation with AU because I've done events such as this with them and with this center over the years, but in real life, I'm an associate professor of political science at George Mason University, where I study American politics and US Congress and political parties. And happily, for me at least, I am available to do this today because I'm on sabbatical this semester doing a fellowship at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress, where I just raced across town from, where I'm working on a book on congressional polarization. But today, we are here to talk about the 2020 nomination, and I'm very pleased to introduce our esteemed panel of scholars and experts to help us work through some of the current happenings. So briefly, to my left here, first we have Candice Nelson, who is the professor and chair of government here at American University and director of the Campaign Management Institute. To her left is Leonard STEINHORN, a professor of communications here at AU, who also sometimes operates as a CBS News analyst. To his left, we have Ron ELVING, the senior editor and news correspondent at National Public Radio and executive in residence at the School of Public Affairs here at AU. And on the end, we have JAMIL Scott, an assistant professor of government at Georgetown University, who is an expert in political ambition and representation. So thank you very much for joining us today. So my plan here is to handle the moderated version of the program for about 45 minutes before we open it up to Q&A. So I'm going to organize this at David's direction, essentially. I'm going to have an open-ended question at the beginning that I'm just going to go down the line and have each of our panelists answer. And then I have a much more targeted question for each of them that is more relevant to their specific areas of expertise. And then, depending on how time goes, hopefully a couple of other general questions for the panel. We'll end with another one going on down the line before we open it up for Q&A. So that's my general plan. All right. So I'll ask the first question here of Professor STEINHORN, and then I'll take a seat. So, Professor STEINHORN, we've heard a lot lately about changes in the Democratic Party and how the Democratic electorate is different now than it was during the Obama years. So, holding all the personal characteristics of the candidates, the 2020 nomination candidates, constant, including their experience, would you rather be running as a moderate or a progressive in this race? In other words, where do you think the heart and soul of the Democratic Party is now?
Okay, well, thanks for being here, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay. Good question. I'm not altogether sure that the soul of the Democratic Party has changed all of that much. It's always been demographically younger, more diverse, better educated, urban, increasingly suburban, socially liberal, economically liberal, and leaning progressive. The question is whether we mistake the Democratic activists for the soul of the Democratic Party, and I think that's critical here. And that's where you have a lot of the pull in this campaign, because some of the activists want the Democratic Party to move in a certain direction, but I'm not altogether sure that the center of the party is with the activists and all of that. Look at Medicare for All. Okay? It's a popular view among the activists of the Democratic Party. It polls reasonably well, but it has a lot of problems. It has specific problems because when you go into the general election, you know you're going to get hammered on the concept of loss aversion, which is that most people will be worried after the Trump campaign hits them that they're going to lose their private insurance, okay? So I'm not altogether sure that the activists necessarily represent the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And so the real question becomes, would I rather be a progressive or a moderate? Well, I think that difference has become overplayed to a great extent in all of this. I still think that many people think that the public option is a progressive option compared to what it used to be years ago, which was no option at all. And I do think that most Democrats generally agree on most of these issues within a certain spectrum. To me, what's more important than the ideological apparent differences is whether these candidates are perceived as authentic or not. I think authenticity is really the heart of this election. When you look at the younger generation, they care most about authenticity, and so how do they define authenticity? Certainly Hillary Clinton did not come off as authentic. She came off as canned and scripted and somebody who was always thinking through how to play a particular issue. On the other hand, Bill Clinton, for all of his flaws, came off as authentic. Barack Obama, who wrote 2 books about himself and sort of disclosed who he was, came off as very authentic. And in this particular campaign, who's coming off as authentic? Elizabeth Warren, with her passion in her selfies. Bernie Sanders certainly comes off as authentic. Joe Biden as regular Joe, even though I think he's been dinged a little bit lately. And the reason why Kamala Harris has fallen a bit is that she always seems like she's contrived and scripted and lacking authenticity. So to some extent, I think the moderate versus progressive dichotomy gets a lot overplayed, and what it all comes down to is who comes off as that authentic candidate that can conceivably stand toe-to-toe with Donald Trump and show people what the soul of the Democratic Party is from their interpretation and make that convincing case to people because they honestly believe it and they're not being focus grouped and coming up with one-liners and coming up with how to manipulate all of these things. The voters want authenticity, and I think that's really going to be the decisive point here.
So that's a great transition, actually, to the next question that I'd like to pose to Professor Scott. A slightly different side of the coin than authenticity is this idea of electability. How does this idea of electability interact with characteristics like race, gender, sexuality, and age? Does it play differently in the minds of voters as they think about the primary election versus the general election? In other words, on balance, is it an advantage or a disadvantage to be a straight white Christian male running for higher office in today's Democratic Party?
So when it comes to this idea of electability, I think on balance, even if we're not talking about the most sophisticated voter, people understand the concept of not wasting their vote. That they believe that they understand the concept of not wasting their vote, right? And so there is an idea that if I'm voting for someone in the primary, I want them to be able to stand toe-to-toe with Donald Trump. And so when it comes to who that looks like, I think largely people assume that that would be Joe Biden. Now, I think, does he still poll very well with, let's say, African-American community? Yes, he's polling very well with the African-American community. If we talk about Elizabeth Warren and where she stands, right, I think she's polling a bit better with younger black voters and younger people generally, right? They like her. They think that this idea that she has a plan, right? But I think people are still thinking about what will she be able to do against Donald Trump. Now, does this idea of electability disadvantage women and people of color? I think it does, unfortunately, right? I think that this idea that who is the voter in the 2016? Who is the voter rather in 2020 as a general election voter? People are assuming that their neighbors are not the most racially progressive, right? Not the most gender progressive, and so even if they like a candidate, they're assuming that my neighbor isn't going to. So there's a thought here about who's going to go up against Donald Trump and who's going to be able to do this well. So there probably are comparisons between that can be made between Hillary Clinton and some of the women that are running right now. Does Hillary Clinton falter in this idea of authenticity and what she brought to the table? Yes. But did she bring some policy expertise to the table? Also, very much so. She did, right? And so the question is, right, as we think about the debate performance of Hillary Clinton, of Donald Trump, right? If you watch those debates again, you might think, did Hillary Clinton win, right? Did she really talk about policy? Yes. But did Donald Trump deliver things that people remembered? Was he shortened to the point? Yes. Do people remember what he said? Yes, right? So the question becomes, right, does this strategy of talking about policy work? Is there someone who can beat Donald Trump in his debate strategy and style? People are thinking these things, and we can't underestimate that people are being considerate about how they'll use their vote in 2020. And so, unfortunately, in a big election like 2020, right, where there is a lot of question about what happens next, where the direction of our country is going, there are so many concerns here, right, and in this era of polarization, extreme polarization, where we don't always get the same political information, and when we are getting the same information, it's with a different, very different frame, right? So we might get the same story with a different idea about what's happening, right? People want to make sure that the person who's going up in 2020 is going to be able to beat Donald Trump. Does this disadvantage people like Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren? Unfortunately, yes. But there were already concerns about Kamala Harris from the start. We cannot forget that Kamala Harris was, as a prosecutor, people did bring up her history as a prosecutor, right? She did her job, yes, as a prosecutor, but when you're prosecuting black and brown folks, you can't think that that's not going to come up with black and brown voters. So she's not polling very well there. She's gotten better, but is Joe Biden still in the mind of people? Particularly when we're thinking about people of color and who's going to turn out, because let's not mistake that 2020 is not who's going to stand with the Democratic Party in terms of how they think about candidates. It's a turnout game. And if candidates are going to get the support of voters, they have to be thinking about how are we going to get people excited to turn out like 2008, right? How are we going to get people excited? And I don't think that there's been enough discussion about how are we going to play the turnout game? How are we going to get people excited to come out? Anger works. We saw 2018. Anger works, but anger against what's happening may not be enough. So,
Thank you very much. Next, I want to turn to Professor Nelson. So as you know, campaign dynamics matter a lot more in presidential nomination elections than they do in general elections. What would you say has run, who would you say has run the most effective campaign so far, and what goes into that? What does the operation look like? Is there a particular campaign that's been very disappointing on that end?
Okay, so I think the candidate that's run the best campaign is Elizabeth Warren. And for two reasons. One is she has consistently put out policy papers, policy ideas. It's not just Trump's terrible, vote for me. Now, she's run into some problems with that. We saw that in the debate last week. But she has consistently put out why people should support her. The second reason, and I think it's equally important and it's going to become even more important, when she first got into the race, and she got in very early, there were a lot of comments about the amount of money she was spending on hiring staff. And that is going to come back to help her once we get into people actually voting. I think that after the debate in November, the race is effectively going to freeze until we get into Iowa, New Hampshire, and the other early primaries. And the fact that Warren has had people on the ground at that point in some states for almost a year is really going to work to her advantage in terms of getting people actually out to the polls to vote in both the caucuses and the primaries. In terms of the most disappointing campaign, that award goes to Beto O'Rourke. He ran a terrific Senate race in 2018. He came close to beating Ted Cruz. He started out, he was the cover story on the Atlantic magazine. He got great crowds in Iowa when he kicked off his race. He's jumping on tables and chairs, and people are really excited. And then that's pretty much been it since. So he came in with a lot of promise, a lot of excitement, and he really hasn't gone anywhere. So,
Thank you very much. I want to follow up for just a second because one of the things you said I thought was a little provocative. You suggested that once we hit November, we're going to see sort of a freeze in the campaigns until we get to the caucuses in February. Can you explain why you think that's the case?
Because we're going into the holiday season. There's a debate on the books. Maybe Ron knows if that's still going to happen in December. But there was a plan for a debate in December.
I don't know about December. They are planning to debate in November.
Right, yeah, on the 20th.
Right, but not December, I don't think.
So I think we get into the holidays, and then once we get into January, the focus is going to be on Iowa and New Hampshire particularly. So and what the polls are showing, what people are doing there, I just don't see a lot of movement at that point.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Elving, as with campaign dynamics, media coverage probably has a bigger influence over the nomination contest than the general election outcome. In what ways do you think the media have influenced this race so far? How do you see that playing out going forward?
The media, yes.
You know, it's one thing.
Indeed. I was just reflecting on a few years ago, some of you may remember a journalist named David Halberstam wrote a great book about Vietnam, and then wrote a book that had a lot of influence in the 1970s called The Powers That Be. And it focused on the 4 leading print organizations in the United States, New York Times, Washington Post, and believe it or not, Time and Newsweek were considered up in that league. And then, of course, the 3 television networks. And he went on at some length about how these supercultural 7, as he called them, were enormous determiners of our politics, particularly in the phase that we're in right now. That there was a primary phase before we even talked to voters in which the candidates were essentially trying to get on the mentioners list. And there was something we used to call the David Broder primary. Some of you may remember David Broder, who was a legendary reporter for the Washington Post, somebody who did all the right things and was an enormously balanced and objective reporter. And there may not have been more than a handful who you could say that about over the years, but certainly David Broder was one. He certainly knocked on more doors than anyone but the Gallup organization over the years. And people really tried hard to get a mention from David Broder. And that was an important part of running for president, was to essentially do the groundwork to be mentioned in the right media places. And these really had an enormous determinative power over who became the leading candidates in either party, but certainly in the Democratic Party. Needless to say, we live in a tremendously different media environment now, so much so that when we even talk about which candidates are doing well or poorly, I'm not sure we really have the proper metrics to know that the polling and even the measuring of money, as reliable as counting dollars may be in many respects, we are in a much different media environment now. And what we have instead of gatekeepers, such as those supercultural 7, no gatekeepers really to speak of anymore, and what we have are portals. And the portals are Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and the people who are doing well in through those portals don't try to influence Facebook and Twitter. They try to influence the people who go to those portals to then go out to 100 or 1,000 other places to get information and misinformation and disinformation. The difference being that disinformation is intentionally misleading. It is intentionally trying to give you a false picture. And as we know, much of that comes from foreign agents. It comes from people overseas. Not exclusively the Russians, but they do seem to be the leading champions at this point. So in this new media environment, while we do still have powerful news organizations, and we can talk about the Fox News presidency, which I think we are having, and that is an important news organization that has tremendous influence on that side of the political spectrum, we have such an unpredictable and different landscape because of the personally chosen sources of information that people have through these portals instead of through gatekeeper organizations, that I think it's difficult to know before we get to real results in Iowa, New Hampshire, et cetera, where we are and basically who's leading this race.
Thank you. Could we have any tech support with some of the microphones? They don't seem to be amplifying.
They do seem to be on.
If I do this, does that help? All right, so this one is working. I'll
So
pass
it's
it.
just proximity. Okay.
Or if we're talking very close, if we could ask panelists to talk very close to the microphones, that might help. I want to do something and just quickly go down the line on one question, and then I've got a couple of things that I want to ask as the group. I'm wondering if there's anything that's happened in the primary campaigns so far that you have been surprised by, a moment or a candidate or something. So down the line.
What surprised me is that the people who were, the three candidates who were the front runners at the beginning are still the front runners. We had 23 people in the race. We still have, what, 18 roughly? But it really, we haven't really seen much of a shakeup. And so that's what surprised me.
Well, I haven't been surprised at all, actually, because I think we've been through these ups and downs for years. You know, how many of us remember frontrunner Howard Dean or Ed Muskie or Scoop Jackson or Jerry Brown or even Hillary Clinton in 2008? And my whole point is, and I may disagree with you a little bit, is I think that there is a media narrative out there, and the media does drive the conversation. And these are content creators that social media then picks up and shares with everybody else. So there's a great deal to be said about that sort of, it may not be those gatekeeper seven, but that amorphous group of political journalists that are writing the narrative of this campaign. And to some extent, you know, they chronicle the rise of a particular candidate, they reinforce it with their articles, then they bake in narratives about other candidates and their strengths and weaknesses, then they get bored with the narrative and the storyline and they look for something else. And I think that's where we're at right now, is they're somewhat bored with this. They're seizing on the weakness of Warren with the Medicare for All. You even see it in a Paul Krugman article in the New York Times recently, where he's raising that question about Elizabeth Warren. And then, so it's really in flux, and I think it always has been in flux in almost every election, particularly with the Democrats. And ultimately, it's the voters in those retail states, Iowa and New Hampshire in particular, they're starting to make their decision. They're dating right now. They have to figure out who they may ultimately want to get engaged with or potentially marry. To me, what's happening is that these early voters are baking in their own calculation about electability and passion and ideological purity and who can beat Donald Trump and who's good enough for them that may be able to beat Donald Trump. Then it's the candidates with the best ground game are out there and the best grassroots support. And I think ultimately, none of this has surprised me because I think we've seen this film before and the media narrative has taught us things and it's taught us how to follow the media narrative as much as we have to follow those candidates.
I see all those as friendly amendments, actually, Lenny. But let me just say that the problem right now is we pay so much attention to the people who pay the most attention. So, for example, people think of Fox as being the dominant news source in America, and they certainly will tell you that every time you turn to Fox. And they say it over and over, largest audience, this and that, et cetera, et cetera. About 2.5 million people on average are watching Fox during prime time on a given evening. That's 2.5 million people. Now, if you take ABC News, NBC News, CBS News, cumulatively, and yes, they are still in business over there on broadcast, they have over 20 million broadcast viewers on just their evening news programs. Just their evening news programs. So that's considerably larger than the average Fox audience. And the single most popular Fox program, Sean Hannity, is 3.3 million at peak. 3.3 million at peak. So compare that then to the 8 million people who watch the ABC evening news. That's something I think it's fair to bear in mind. Plus, just in the space of cable news alone, CNN and MSNBC taken together easily exceed the Fox audience. And when Rachel Maddow is on, for example, she runs a pretty close second, sometimes even slightly ahead of Sean Hannity, over 3 million viewers. So we all have this impression of that juggernaut. And I only throw that out because there is a sense that everyone is on Twitter, for example. Only about 22% of Americans are actually on Twitter, and only 10% of that percentage, that minority, does political Twitter. The rest of the people are tweeting about important things like baseball and the World Series and all the other things that matter to people. So of that 10%, or rather by that 10% of the 22%, we get, how much do you think of all the political Twitter there is? 97%. Almost all political Twitter comes from 10% of 22%. So we are really down to talking about some ferocious Twitter users. I can think of one in particular, lives here in Washington, D.C., and the response to that person makes up an enormous percentage of all the political Twitter there is. So a lot of all of this that we're feeding on all the time, and the ideas we're getting about how the candidates are doing and not doing, is from that very narrow space within the general political world. And when we get to Iowa and New Hampshire, we're going to find perhaps a somewhat different set of reactions.
I think the thing that was most surprising to me is the early attention to campaign staff. There was a discussion very early on about who was on staff and how diverse staffs were, and we usually don't get into these conversations. We often don't think about how much the campaign staff can matter they're pivotal for decision making in terms of what direction the campaign goes in, how do we think about policy, what steps the candidate takes and where they're going, right? And so the attention to diversity there and calling people to task for not doing it, I think it was really meaningful and might have implications for what we see for the candidate, where the candidate who makes it to the general election will go.
I want to follow up on that. Does anybody, whether for anybody on the panel, I guess, know which of the current candidates has adopted more of the legacy campaign staff from both Clinton and Obama? Has anybody looked at that? Just out of curiosity?
Well, I would guess Biden.
I would guess that as well, but I don't know.
I don't know for that for a fact, but I would guess Biden just because Biden
Right.
had a line on a lot of Obama people. Hillary had picked up a lot of Obama's people
Right.
in 2016. Was not necessarily well served by some of them, but she certainly thought they were the people who knew how to reach voters in 2016.
Yeah.
And there's one more point, is that some people are concerned that some of those longtime veterans don't get the new media ecosystem on Facebook and the need to do all of the advertising to reach people. When you look at what the Trump campaign is doing under Brad Parscale, they are flooding Facebook. They are beta testing ads on a constant basis. They're trying to figure out whether certain language or certain background colors are going to make a difference in terms of how people respond to all of this. And they're pouring millions upon millions of dollars into all of that, whereas some of the legacy advisors are putting a lot of their money right now, as Joe Biden's campaign is, into TV advertising. Now, is that smart? It may be, if he believes that his demographic is 55 and older and they're watching legacy TV and potentially watching enough ads to be able to be reached by a particular ad they're putting out. But the bottom line is that if you're not playing in all of these fields and not playing effectively in all of these fields, then you may well fall behind. And clearly right now the Trump campaign has an advantage on that.
That's an excellent point. Let me pose another question to anybody on the panel who'd like to respond. I have the sense that the impeachment inquiry going on Capitol Hill is having a sort of homogenizing, coalescing effect amongst Democrats, at least the elites that are currently elected. And I'm wondering how you think the impeachment process changes primary politics. In a way, it's weird to me because they're both similar processes, right? So with impeachment, you've got this process of Democrats coming together to a particular point of decision making, which is the same kind of thing that's going on in the primary process in a very different venue, using very different strategies. But what I'm wondering your thoughts on is how, as that coalescing is going on Capitol Hill with respect to impeachment, that might affect primary politics.
I think it's making it much harder for Democratic candidates to get their message out, to get people to pay any attention to the primaries at all, because impeachment is just sucking all the air out of the room, and that's going to continue. We talked about, the race freezing. Impeachment is going to be the story, for the next few months at least, and that's just going to make it harder and harder for people to pay attention to the Democratic candidates and their messages.
So I think from a different perspective, I think that what's hard about the impeachment, what's going on with everything around impeachment is that I don't think the average American understands what's really happening. And so I think as we talk about impeachment, and it's very easy to think that like this is all that's going on because we're in DC, right? And like I'll talk to my students and they can give me a quick answer about what's happening, but I doubt the average American would. And so we keep talking about impeachment. And I think what will be very pivotal as we move through the primary and to the general is if this is going to be something that a general election candidate is going to bring up as an attack, right? They actually have to make sure that the general public understands what happened and what's the impact of this, right? Because I don't think it's very clear to everyone what this is all about, right?
And I think the voters multitask very well. And I think the voters in those retail states are going out to all of these town meetings, talking with the candidates, speaking with the organizers that Candy was talking about, figuring out who they would like best to run against Donald Trump. And remember, most of those voters in the Democratic Party who will be voting already don't like Donald Trump. So it's already built into how they're viewing the world, and they want to choose somebody who can run against him. I do think that and you talk about the general election, that the sort of continuing drip of information about Trump and the alleged corruption of his administration, and if the impeachment goes public with these hearings and have somebody like Ambassador Taylor detailing on television the same way John Dean may have done 45 years ago, I think that will make a difference as sort of independent voters evaluate who the Democrats choose and start to think about whether they want to keep Donald Trump in the White House. So it may well be that they're paying attention to both things at the same time, and that the impeachment process may actually have a greater result on the independent voters, the people who are more in the middle, than the actual Democrats going out and voting in the early states.
Excellent points. A number of you have brought up, or maybe I think everybody has brought up Iowa and New Hampshire as the first contests. Whom do you think the sequential voting system and the calendar advantages most to anybody?
Well, I'd make a first observation that having a lot of states drop their caucuses and go to a primary would appear to have been done in part to disadvantage Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders picked up a tremendous bonus of delegates by concentrating on caucuses in 2016, as in fact Barack Obama had done in 2008. It was a crucial part of his campaign that they went to the Dakotas and Montana and Idaho and organized caucuses where they could get a disproportionate number of delegates by winning in the caucus. That was something the Hillary campaign essentially just neglected to do. They said, well, we didn't really think that those caucuses were going to be worth much. And in fact, they admitted at one of the post-election forums that they really hadn't even read the rules about the disproportionate delegate allocation out of the caucuses. So that hurt them very badly in 2008. And a lot of the states have looked around and said, who shows up at the caucuses? It's a handful, relatively speaking, even smaller than the universe of a primary, which is pretty select already. And those people tend to be activists. They tend to be the people who are producing 97% of the political Twitter. And they are going to be over on one side of the spectrum in all likelihood in either party. They're going to be the polarized of the polarized. And so they were, at least in 2016, very friendly to Bernie Sanders. And so this has been read as a sort of anti-Sanders, anti-insurgent move being made by the parties in the various states. And I think that would tend to advantage a more establishment candidate if there were clearly an establishment candidate. But right now, Joe Biden seems to be in danger of sliding out of that designation.
The other thing I would look at in the polls is the ranked choice in the polls. I wouldn't look at who's leading in the polls, but who is second and third among the people when they're asked about all this, because it's the 15% threshold in these states, and particularly in Iowa, where you need that 15% to be able to score delegates in the Iowa caucuses. So who are these candidates looking at second and third? So when their top choice may not reach a threshold and may not seem as viable, who is that second and third choice? So that's what I'm going to be looking out for, because ultimately the way these primaries and caucuses are structured is you have to reach a threshold to be able to get a certain number of delegates.
I want to put a couple of points together here that I heard, because one is, if we take Candy's point that it's the Warren campaign that's the best organized, and Ron's point that it's really important to pay attention to the rules and delegate allocation, then that would suggest that perhaps the Warren campaign is most advantaged in terms of the rule setup, or at least in the best position to take advantage of that. Agree or disagree?
I think it's hard to know at this point. I mean, I think we'll see what happens in the next couple of months. But, you know, Sanders has run before, Biden's run before. They know what the rules are, what they need to do. It's the question of the second, you know, down the, you know, Buttigieg, Harris, how are they going to figure out how to play with these rules?
Any other thoughts on the calendaring?
Well, obviously California's, you know, moved up, and that's a huge cash, and that would seem to advantage Kamala Harris. But on the other hand, maybe it won't, because California likes to vote for somebody that they think is going to win, and if Kamala Harris hasn't broken out by then, hasn't somehow broken through and become a much more well, one of the leading candidates, one of the top several, and you know, we used to say there were 3 tickets out of Iowa, 2 tickets out of New Hampshire, and maybe with this large a field and this much of a what should we call it, a discombobulated political landscape and environment, there will be more tickets out of Iowa and New Hampshire, and maybe it'll really be South Carolina and Nevada that winnow the field, particularly if South Carolina produces a comeback for Joe Biden, as the Biden campaign is clearly hoping. So we could see maybe half a dozen candidates still viable by then, and then California could actually be really important in sorting out a big chunk of delegates, and maybe Kamala Harris could base a comeback there. But my guess is we're going to see a lot of traditional states falling into the kind of roles they had before, Wisconsin picking somebody like Bernie, as they did in 2016, or George McGovern in 1972. Yes, right. And, you know, all the other people that they've gone for who were more challengers to the establishment.
I think as we move forward, I think it'll be even more important to think about who's still sticking in the race, because I think it has implications for excitement about the general election. I think there were a number of Bernie supporters who opted out in 2016 general election, and some of them were even switchers, right? Something that we wouldn't predict. So what does it mean that someone who was a Bernie supporter in the primary then becomes a Trump voter in the general election? And so as we go into the general election with such a large field of candidates, I think we have to be cognizant about the impact that may have as these, especially as these candidates get people excited. Will they help the chosen candidate continue to keep people excited, or will they completely opt out, right? I don't know if the Andrew Yang supporters of the world will be a general election supporter for the Democratic Party in 2016. They put me in the mind of perhaps some switchers. And so we have to think about what that means for the Democratic Party and their ability to turn out voters.
No, I think that's a really, really key point. Okay, I want to ask one last question. I won't say down the line, but of each candidate, or of each panelist, rather. I just promoted you all, or maybe it's a demotion, I'm not sure. And put everybody on the hot seat about their own prognostication, and then we'll open up to Q&A here. So in the end, how many people would you say have a real chance at being the nominee? Who are they? What are their respective odds? And why?
Could we turn off the videotape?
I'm going to say 5. Sanders, Warren, and Biden. I think Buttigieg is interesting. I wouldn't rule him out yet. And then one other, and I don't know who that other is. But I think unless somebody other than Sanders, Biden, and Warren really take off, I think it's going to be one of those 3.
Who has the biggest odds? I'm going to go for the Nationals right now, winning the World Series. There we go. But I always follow Yogi Berra, speaking of baseball, when he said, I never make predictions, especially about the future. It was 44 years ago this week when the New York Times wrote their big article basically saying there's somebody who's going to surprise you in Iowa that year, and that happened to be Jimmy Carter. When Jimmy Carter announced his candidacy, his home state paper, the Atlanta Constitution, had a big headline which was Jimmy Who? And all of a sudden he wins the presidency of the United States. So I agree that a lot's going to depend on the ground game, and a lot's going to depend on the media narrative of who sort of captures that moment in the imagination of people at the exact time when people are solidifying their choices over the holidays, in conversations with family and friends, when they have a chance to talk and think about all of this stuff. And so that's what I'm going to be looking out for in the weeks ahead, is what is that media narrative telling me at that exact moment when people begin to make those decisions? So right now, yeah, it's easy to say all of those front runners, but you never know if an Amy Klobuchar or a Cory Booker, who happens to have a decent ground game, may emerge at some point, because it could be Cory Who or Amy Who, and all of a sudden they could get the nomination. So I just don't know.
And I think that's really the only honest answer. I like your list very much, Candy. Make this slight amendment to it. I would say probably the three leaders go forward and have a real chance. Any one of them could have a scenario. And then either Harris or Booker. Now, if Kamala Harris can't break through, I do think there's a lane there for Cory Booker. I don't know why he has not done better. I think if there's one person who has surprised me by not having more appeal, more evident appeal, it would be Cory Booker. I think he's done very well in the debates. So one of those two I would make my fourth. And then whoever wins Iowa, if it's not one of the people I've already named. So if either Klobuchar or Mayor Pete breaks through in Iowa, then that person's going to be around.
This is a very hard question. So I think there's certainly room to talk about Sanders, Warren, and Biden. As far as Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, I'm not sure if they have as much as a chance as we might have assumed before the Obama election. I think that there's a lot of conversation about them, and after Obama, I think there are voters who are looking for what can you actually do, right? Beyond this being in symbolic importance to the black community, if we're talking about black voters in particular. Kamala Harris isn't polling well with black women, right? And so not as great as we might expect. She has some, right? But not as great as we might expect. Cory Booker, I don't think he's polling very well with black women either. And so not to say that black women are the only metric, but I think they're a metric that we have to be thinking about. They are strong voters, and there's a lot of interest in Biden and Warren, some Sanders too. So it's a hard decision to make about who's gonna be at the end, but I think those three might have the best shot. There's some interest in Julian Castro, but I think at this point Julian Castro isn't playing to win; he's playing to be heard. And I think at this point he has the best chance of having his policies be pushed forward in any presidency because he's bringing up questions that people want to be talking about. So,
And just there's a CNN poll out today that has Biden up considerably from where he was the last time. But what's even more interesting in the poll is 42% of African Americans favor Biden. For Harris, for Warren and Sanders, it's 13 and 16%. So Biden is holding on to that vote.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the floor. And if I could ask for a little bit of help with running the microphone, that would be great. We've got a question from the red-shirted gentleman in the back there.
There are so many things that I can think of for questions, but I have two major questions. One is for the panels thinking about the health of the candidates and how that may affect what you have learned. The Democratic candidates, particularly Mr. Sanders and Vice President Biden, and also the Republican candidate. How is the health of the candidates being viewed? The second question I have is the role of environmental issues in galvanizing the populace, particularly the young voters, to get to the polls. Because I believe Ms. Scott, I think you said, you used the term turnout game. And so I would particularly like to know about the environment, which seems to be, it should be a concern of all of ours, but particularly a young person's. So the issues, so the health of the candidates and the role of the environment in the candidates. What is your point of view as to how this is affecting the candidates at this point?
Well, I think the health of the candidates is going to be in how they perform. Senator Sanders had a heart attack, but he came back in the debate and he looked robust and engaged. I don't know if people will say, well, you know, because he's 78 or Biden's, what, 76, that they're too old to be president. I don't think that will be the case. I think people will judge them on how they perform on the campaign trail. In terms of the environment, I think that's going to be a huge issue in turning out young people. I mean, climate change is something that's really, really important. All of us see that with our students. And so the candidate that can speak to that issue, to that demographic, is going to have the best option of turning them out.
I generally agree. I think the fact that Bernie Sanders has come back to the campaign trail sprinting, that he's energized, that he's going to go out there and prove that this was just a temporary health blip. I don't think his people will criticize him because of that, because they also don't want to alienate older voters and suggest that older voters themselves don't have agency. In some ways, that may actually help Joe Biden if he continues to show a revived vigor on the campaign trail. And what's interesting is when you look at some of those second choice voters, Biden does well against people who with people who support Sanders first, and Biden is often second or third in that group because they tend to be older folks who are supporting each of those candidates, even though Bernie certainly has his younger cohort. I also agree that it's turnout, but I always caution people on turnout. And while I think young people have to turn out in large numbers, I look at what may be the most critical state in November of 2020, and that's Wisconsin. And I look at the demographics of Wisconsin and realize that most counties in Wisconsin have lost population of people, I think it's 25 and younger, and their population is getting older among those voters. So yes, you need those young people to be turning out, to be mobilized, but if they turn out in Los Angeles and New York and Chicago, that may not ultimately affect the end result of the Electoral College come November of 2020. But the bottom line is you have to excite the progressive base, and certainly sustainability in the environment is one of the key issues in that overall fabric.
Well, in health, I would say, first of all, hats off to Bernie Sanders' surgery team. That had to be one of the most successful heart operations in the history of presidential politics for somebody who's still running. You could certainly say he got his 2 stents worth, but at any rate, and more than that, I mean, that was the best debate performance he's had in years. And it was almost as though he had been hugely energized by the health issue and by the surgery. And it was as though somehow he had been operating on fewer than all cylinders up until that point. Suddenly we got the real Bernie again, full Bernie. And so I don't think it's an issue for him as a candidate. However, whether you're talking about him or Joe Biden, the idea of a president turning 80 in his first term, and in the case of Bernie Sanders in his first year in the White House, that concerns me. That concerns me. As a person who has come to feel differently about all the age issues in recent years, I think that that's something to bear in mind. This is a job that I think we'd like to see somebody doing on a full-time basis, 7 days a week, and being really up to it physically and mentally. And here's one more thing. if you were elected president in our era, you're not hiring somebody for 4 years. You're hiring somebody for 2 terms. You want a re-electable president so that you can get the incumbency advantage that's so strong in our political history. You don't want somebody who's just signing off after 4 or fewer. So that's a factor. You want somebody with longevity as a hiree in this case. And as far as the environment, I completely agree. This is one of those places the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, if it should so choose, must lay claim to the youth vote. And by youth vote, I mean everyone who wants to be around for a few more years in a livable environment. But it's certainly anybody under 30.
So in regards to health, I think we talked about the media earlier, and I think the media does have an important role in priming. So before the debate, right, there was a lot of conversation about, Bernie hasn't told us about his health records, what's happening there, right? There hasn't been much talk about that. It's been more about his debate performance. And so given that the media does have this priming ability, right, I don't think it's going to be much of a conversation. I don't think the conversation has recently been about, Bernie, we would like to see the note from your doctor to say you're okay, right? But I think that could be a conversation if the media pushes it. I doubt they will. I think that people are going to focus more on his debate performance and push for what happens next. If he gets sick again, right, and that becomes a conversation, then I think we will see more talk about it and more concern about it, and that be primed in people's heads to think about. In regards to the issue of the environment, right, I think that this is an issue that young people are interested in and do want to hear more about. I think in order for this to become a conversation that is not just focused on one demographic of young people, right, we have to think about the nuances of the environment conversation, right? So we can talk about climate change, and yes, that's very important, but we should also be talking about living in a neighborhood where they're dumping, right? If you're in a space in which you live by a chemical plant, right? Those are conversations that people can get behind and think about, right? And so it isn't just about climate change, which is extremely important, yes, but I think we need to bring it home to people about how much climate change is affecting them in their daily lives.
I'll add to that point, in thinking about young voters, I saw the statistics just the other day that if you compare midterm turnout in 2014 to midterm turnout in 2018, particularly in that younger demographic, from 18 to 25-year-old voters, the difference is 80% higher. So they still don't, we're still talking about, 30% turnout or something like that in that age group. But they were significantly more motivated to vote in 2018 than they were in 2014. And if we see that same swing in 2020, then those are turnout changes that can make a real difference. Another question from the audience over here.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a senior in SPA, and a lot of my studies have focused on how media can influence voter turnout. So a lot of Americans will consume their news through forms of soft news, so such as late-night TV shows, social media, things like that. And I think that can play into the authenticity factor you were talking about in terms of giving candidates a space to, quote-unquote, be more themselves or be a little more not as presented as they would be in other spaces. So what kind of role do you think those sorts of appearances are going to play on this election in terms of specifically like going on late night talk shows or doing these like social media interviews that are distributed so widely, especially on Twitter or Snapchat, things that younger people are focusing on?
Go ahead.
I think the Elizabeth Warren selfie phenomenon is a big deal. And what that shows is that she understands that saying she has a plan for this is necessary for her candidacy, but not sufficient to seal the deal. And look, it's a personal decision that people make when they vote for a president. This is something that they are going to then have a conversation about why they voted for a particular person. It's what we do in all of life. When students choose to come to American University, they tell a story about why they chose to come to American University. When people say who they want to vote for president, they tell a story about that. So I think what's really happening now is the candidates who are best able to tell that story publicly, and those venues you're talking about are a big part of it, you have to give people a story to tell about why they chose somebody to become president. Donald Trump gave people that story, okay, in a lot of ways in 2016. And he continues to give people that story as the disruptor president who's battling the status quo. And I think somebody who mentioned Andrew Yang, are those voters going to stay with the Democratic Party? Are they attracted to a disruptor, and will all of a sudden that translate to Donald Trump if Andrew Yang doesn't do better in these primaries? So basically what you're talking about is who is best going to capture the ability to tell the story that people need to tell themselves and their friends as to why they are supporting a particular candidate. And I do think that's a really big deal. And it goes all the way back to when John Kennedy appeared on Edward R. Murrow in Person to Person in the 1950s and talked about his marriage. And he played that story very well up through the 1960 election. The candidates who have played the story well, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, have done probably the best job getting elected.
Yes, and used whatever the cutting-edge technology of that moment was. Television for Kennedy, Arsenio Hall's late-night show for Bill Clinton on the saxophone, and then, of course, Obama being the first really successful, making friends candidate on, Facebook and so on, and then Donald Trump with that enormous array of things that were both intentional and perhaps entirely, let us just say, accidental, that were done on his behalf by others. What's the breakthrough for 2020? What's the new technology? What is it? What is the way that you're going to reach people that no one's ever done it quite the same way before, based on some new technological breakthrough? And if you have that answer, I'd really like to speak to you immediately after we end the program.
One more quick question from the audience. Let's go to the other side of the room, then we will have hit all corners here.
Thank you. I actually have a statement as well as a question. So I've been listening to the panel and their responses. One of the things that I would like to hear from the panel, we had a conversation about their presidential picks, but what about, we've made it through the actual primary, we're now going to the general election. Where do you see and who do you see would be the best matchup in regards to president and VP pick to be able to take on the Trump administration in re-election? One of the things that I've seen from history is, in my opinion, I think that, the VP pick, it matters. It really does matter. We saw that in Obama and Biden. One of the things that I think that American voters liked about Obama is he was relatable. He had the ability to be able to speak directly to them. Some of his stories, some of his history, his upbringing. But the folks that he missed in his particular cultural bucket, he picked up those voters through Joe Biden, the middle of America voters, et cetera. We also saw that work in tandem the opposite way with McCain and Palin. So when we're looking at opportunities to say, look, if these two people were to team up, I think that they would have the best shot at defeating Donald Trump in the general. Who would your choice be for the presidential and vice presidential matchup?
Well, what we know from political science is typically the presidential candidate will try and pick somebody as his or her VP that brings something in addition to the ticket, be it age, demographics, experience with Obama and Biden. So if I'm right, and it's any of those top three, that would suggest that whoever their pick is if it's Biden or Sanders, they would pick somebody younger, and perhaps somebody of color. If it's Warren, again, somebody younger, and perhaps somebody of color as well. So, I mean, history shows us that that's how it plays out. Who exactly those will be, I think Buttigieg is interesting.
I think one of the most consequential vice presidential picks, for the reasons you're suggesting, was Donald Trump's vice president, Mike Pence. He was a guy who sowed a lot of doubts, Donald Trump, among evangelicals, and it was Mike Pence who basically sort of said, no, you can trust this guy, and turn out in large numbers. And it turns out that Trump's biggest base right now is among older evangelical voters. And that's why he would never get rid of Mike Pence on that ticket. He needed Mike Pence, and he needs Mike Pence. If it were me and I were advising, let's say, Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden, I would say absolutely slam dunk choose Stacey Abrams as your vice presidential candidate.
I would agree with that. I think Stacey Abrams, of any campaign that we can think of, has did an amazing job of mobilizing people and getting people registered to vote. And if we think about 2020 as being the importance of a ground game and getting people to turn out, Stacey Abrams did that, and she came closer than a lot of us thought she would. I didn't think it would be as close as it was. And so the fact that she was able to get people not only registered, but interested in turning out in a campaign, in a race that was certainly not in her favor, she came a lot closer than she probably should have.
There was actually even a boomlet earlier this year for having Joe Biden literally say, my vice presidential choice will be Stacey Abrams. That's not to anyone's advantage to do too early, but this would certainly be a way that she could pursue her acknowledged right here in Bender when she gave the School of Public Affairs commencement address earlier this year. Her acknowledged interest in being president, but her clear preference not to run this year as a candidate. This would work very well for her. There's one caveat, and that is that you, generally speaking, don't want to be outshone by your vice presidential candidate. And at least in terms of charisma and in terms of big auditoria and so forth, Stacey Abrams would threaten to do that to much of this field. So it largely depends on who the person is. I also think Amy Klobuchar has some potential for balancing a ticket. And Mayor Pete is fascinating as a person who would not outshine you, but would clearly be there to provide a lot of firepower intellectually and perhaps appeal. If you're talking about a candidate of color is at the top of the ticket and so forth, to provide a little balance in that sense. One thing is clear, in the Democratic Party, the age of 2 white males is over, not coming back.
And on that note, I think we've hit right up here on our time mark. So I want to thank all of you for your participation and your attention and your excellent questions and your engagement. Thank you very much.